Welcome to the cheapest way to make high clarity pour over coffee. In this technique, we are not going to use any fancy equipment, but rather rely on our understanding of percolation concepts to get us tasty, consistent results. In this example, I use a plastic V60 because it's cheap and usually pretty accessible, but you can use a brewer of your choice. I also use the V60 size 02 tabbed filters that are usually pretty commonly available for cheap. We will need a cheap scale with a precision of 1 gram or lower and something that can measure up to maybe a kilo. Next, we will need a WDT tool. For conical brewers, I would recommend that the needles in the WDT tool are spread apart by no more than 1 centimeter. Such tools can easily be made at home by fitting acupuncture needles into a rubber cork of some sort. After that, we are going to need a spoon. The spoon can be any size. Just make sure it's not too small because we're going to use it to break the kettle stream, and you should not end up scalding your fingers in the process. Finally, we're going to need something to pour hot water from. This does not have to be a gooseneck kettle. It can be a regular spouted kettle or some kind of a water pan. Start by grinding 20 grams of your coffee of choice at a relatively coarse grind. Rinse your paper filter so that it adheres to the brewer and dump the grounds into the filter. Shake the brewer a bit to level the bed. Hold your spoon close to the top of the bed and pour from your kettle onto the spoon, breaking the stream. Pour about 3.5 to 4 times the weight of the dose while continuing to hold the spoon near the top of the slurry. Pick up your WDT tool and start stirring aggressively while going as deep as you can go without touching the filter. This is the amount of agitation I do for a coffee with normal amount of fines and for a tabbed V60 filter. For a coffee with lesser amount of fines, I agitate quite a bit longer, sometimes even after the water has seemingly drained from the bed. It's okay for the brewer to move around a little bit like this. In all this time, I haven't really touched the filter paper with the needles. In contrast, if you have a coffee that generates tons of fine, you want to agitate as gently as possible so that you're, for most part, saturating the grounds but not dislodging too many fines in the process. Let's talk a little bit about the concepts behind what we just did during the bloom. Now, a lot of people love swirling their blooms. This has its own positives and negatives. But a while ago, I saw Lance Hedrick use a spoon to stir his bloom very, very gently. And I was wondering maybe he was doing that to dislodge as little fines as possible. Now, what if someone cannot afford a $150 kettle that can pour a beautiful stream at 5 milliliter per second? In such a situation, one would want to dislodge the necessary amount of fines during the bloom itself. Now, we are also aiming for higher clarity, which means that we are going to end up grinding coarser than usual. But now if you're grinding coarse and you do not provide sufficient contact time to the boulders, you are going to end up with a somewhat insufficiently extracted brew that's not going to taste that great. You may be tempted to grind finer to generate more fines for said contact time, but then you risk pushing a lot of delicious coffees into muted territory, or quote unquote over extraction, which isn't necessarily always astringent but still doesn't taste that great. Conversely, if you grind high fines coffees much coarser, then you'll be left with, again, suboptimal extraction. So instead, we are looking to vary grind as little as possible and instead use wet WDT to dislodge the necessary amount of fines that we need depending on our combination of coffee and grinder. Now that our 2-minute bloom is over, let's begin with the main pours. Once again, we keep the spoon as close as possible to the top of the slurry. This time pouring to about 65% of total water by weight, all the time ensuring that we do not really disturb the bed as much as possible. Since the water column is tall at this point, you can do a Rayo spin / Hoffman swirl to flatten the bed. Some of you may have a concern that spinning the brewer may agitate the bed too much and dislodge more fines. But I've found that while the water column is tall, spinning the bed doesn't really add that much to the drawdown time. I have also found that shaking the brewer, much like Lance Hedrick does, is a good way to dislodge boulders stuck on the walls of the brewer. Now remember that the aim here is to provide as much contact time as possible to the brew water. This doesn't exactly mean that you stall the brew, but you have to ensure that the drawdown is slow. If you notice that the first drawdown is too fast, you can do another round of wet WDT when the slurry height is small so that you can access as much of the bed as possible for agitation. I want to give a shout out to Aramse who came up with the spoon technique to break the kettle stream to avoid agitation, and also Sarva from Lanscord who suggested that I use it. Now while this final pour draws down, let's talk a little bit about why I chose not to agitate the bed with a kettle stream. Now this might get a little bit speculative and pocket sciencey, so bear with me. I have anecdotally noticed that any approach that dislodges fines from the bed into the slurry above it and gets deposited on the walls has more often than not correlated with increased amounts of body in the final brew. Now, this may not necessarily be bad, but I do want to address what might be causing this phenomenon. My pocket science theory here is that a kettle stream that disrupts the bed is able to dislodge slow diffusing compounds into the slurry, which would otherwise have been inaccessible. However, using wet WDT, I'm being able to ensure that all of the agitation remains restricted to below the surface of the bed. This here is key because according to Jonathan Gagne, the coffee bed works as a massive filter that works to, filter out a lot of the fines, a lot of the astringent compounds maybe. And I'm speculating that in this case, it also traps the compounds that are associated with the perception of body. My recommendation here for sufficient contact time would be for the brew, excluding the bloom, to be somewhere between 3 to 4 minutes, which would mean that with a bloom that's 2 minutes long, your total duration would be somewhere between 5 to 6 minutes. Not only are the resultant brews extremely delicious with high flavor separation, but they also tend to yield pretty high despite the coarse grind, and the variance in extraction yield isn't all that high. Thanks for watching, and a huge shout out to Christopher Ferran for encouraging to pursue this approach.